Hello and welcome. It's Jennifer McGuire, and I appreciate that you stopped by today. So this video is going to focus on creating shadowbox cards in the Slimline size. Now, I've done a couple Slimline videos lately. I promise I won't be doing that all the time in the future, but a few people asked if you could do shadowboxes with Slimline, and so I thought I'd put it into action. I have many examples for you, all demonstrating different ways to do this so that you can hopefully use the products you have and come up with something that would work. Now, if you're interested in making shadowbox cards in a traditional card size, I will link up here to a couple videos that show that, and also at the end of this video. Or you can watch today's video and just think of how you could alter it to do a traditional size. Okay, let's dive into our first example. I think it's best with these cards to look at the completed card so you know the direction we're headed. This card fits in a traditional letter size envelope, and when it comes out of the envelope, it pops up, creating wonderful shadow box-like dimension. It stands on its own nicely, but you can see it flattens for the envelope. For this card, I used a small die set that I bought a long time ago and have wanted to use. This is the Trinity Stamps Snowman Border Builder dies. There are many little pieces that you can arrange to create fun and playful snowmen. There are so many possibilities with these little die cuts. I'm going to keep it pretty simple today, but know there are many options. Off screen, I die cut all of the dies from white cardstock, and then any that needed color, I added color to those tiny white die cuts with a marker. So I assembled them, and look at all these adorable little snowmen. The die set does come with the eyes and buttons for the snowmen, but I decided just to use a black glaze pen for the eyes, and I'll add silver gems for the buttons later on. By the way, I printed this from the Trinity Stamps website. There's all the different little snowmen that you can do. So checking out the guides they have on the websites is always helpful. Next, I'm using the new Trinity Stamps Slimline Modern Embossed panels. So this has 4 large dies that are great for Slimline cards that actually create a little ridge too, which I'll show you later. And then also this die that creates 3 windows. I'll be using the 3 window die, and then the largest of the rectangle. If you don't have dies like this, you could definitely use individual square dies and just die cut them to create 3 windows on your card. As I mentioned, these large rectangle dies have a ridge. If you look closely at the die edge, there's a little ridge that embosses right inside of the cutting line. So I have this large rectangle die and the 3 square die, and I'm positioning those onto white cardstock, and I'll run it through my die cut machine. If you don't have this particular die, you can use an individual square and cut it 3 times. Now, one of the things I get asked a lot about is, can you use your traditional die cut machine to cut these long slimline cards? For this particular one, which I think is about 8.5 inches long, I found that my Gemini Junior plates were big enough. I could run it through fine. But some die cut machines have a little bit shorter cutting plates, like my Spellbinder Platinum, but you can still do the die cutting with this machine. All you do is you put most of your die in between the cutting plates, as you see me doing here. A little bit of it will be hanging out on the right, but that's okay. We will do another pass through to cut the rest of that, and this works absolutely fine. I've never had a problem with it, so you can try it with your machine. Now I'll move my paper and die over so that this other end on the right is in between the cutting plates, and I'll run that through. And now everything has gotten the pressure, and it'll cut through beautifully. So now we have the rectangle with the 3 square windows, and you can see that detailed ridge that was embossed in the edge of the rectangle. I really like the look of that. If you don't have the die set, you can definitely cut your own piece to 8.5 by 3.5, and then use a square die to cut the 3 windows. Let's now do the shadow box card itself. What I'm about to share would work for any type of shadow box, so you can follow these basic dimensions. I have 2 pieces of white cardstock that are 4 by 11 inches. On both of these, I'll score at a 1/2 inch and 1 inch from each end. This will end up in a card that, when flattened, is 4 inches by 9 inches. Which is a pretty big slimline card, but it fits beautifully in a basic letter envelope. So again, these are 4 by 11, and I'm scoring at a 1/2 inch and 1 inch from each end of both pieces. Now I'm using a bone folder just to reinforce those fold lines. So I'll end up with 2 pieces that have like these little Z's sticking off the end. These little folded flaps will kind of form springs that will make our card go from flat to shadow box when taken out of the envelope. Very basic design. You could decorate this or die cut this however you want. When squished down, it is 4 by 9 inches. I have a piece of blue cardstock that's a little bit smaller. This is 8.5 by 3.5. And I'm gluing that inside one of these pieces. When you peer through our little windows, you'll see that blue showing. The other white folded piece will be the front of our card, but we need to cut the square windows into it also. Here I have the rectangle piece with the 3 square windows that we cut earlier. I'm holding it centered on the front of the white folded piece. Into the windows, the square windows, I'm popping the square window die, and then I'm tracing in that with a pencil. This will help me to make sure that my square windows line up. So I line up my square window die with the pencil lines we just traced, and I ran that through my die cut machine. Now I have the square windows in the folded pop-up piece, and they line up with the rectangle piece we die cut earlier. So there are many ways you could go about doing this. I just felt like this one made the most sense. But again, you can use individual square dies for this effect too. Okay, so now we can go ahead and add our pieces and then assemble the card. In each of those windows, I wanted a little white die cut snowbank for a little snowman to stand on. There is a snowbank die that you see over there on the right, included in that Snowmen border builder set I showed you earlier. So I just cut pieces from those die cut borders and line them up onto the windows. To cover up the bottom of these borders, I have my other rectangle piece with the 3 die cut windows, and I'm gluing that on top. Now you know me, I love dimension. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but I die cut 2 additional rectangles with the 3 window openings, and I'm gluing those on top also. I like dimension. Dimension does sometimes add to the cost of mailing your card, but I feel like it's worth those extra few cents so that your handmade card gets there nicely and it has a nice finished look to it. But it's totally up to you. Okay, now we can add our little snowmen. So I'm using a strong liquid adhesive to glue the bottom of the snowman onto the snowbanks. I like Gina K Connect liquid adhesive because I can be sure that just that tiny bit will hold these in place. The last thing we need to do before we assemble our card is add a sentiment, and I used one from the Trinity Stamp Slimline Christmas Magic stamp set. If you like Slimline cards, be sure to check out all of the Slimline stamps, dies, and stencils that Trinity Stamps has. They have an amazing category of Slimline, and they can also be used for regular cards too. So I just glued that one on top, and now the front of our card is completed, and we just need to adhere it to the back. But I do want to mention one thing at this point. I do think it is good to double up cardstock on that big back panel and on the big front panel because you don't want this card to be floppy. It's a long card and we want it to pop up nice. So by doubling up cardstock, like I did here with that extra blue in there, and doubling up on the front and even putting more layers on the front makes it stronger and it'll pop up better. And I'll talk more about that. I did decide at the last minute to add some white snowflakes on the blue panel so that they'll show through the windows. But now we can assemble our card. So on the 2 outermost flaps of this back piece, I'm putting strong double-sided adhesive. You could use strong liquid adhesive if you want. Just make sure it's strong because you want this to stay together. This is Lawn Fawn double-sided tape. This is only going on that 1/2 inch flap on the outer edge on both sides. Now I can take the 1/2 inch flap of the front panel and press it onto that. So we'll have these 2 flaps smushed together on both sides. So you can see how I'm putting those together too, just lining them up. This is my favorite way to make a shadowbox card because those flaps on the side actually form kind of like a spring that when you take it out of the envelope, it pops open. Next, for little buttons on my snowman, which I forgot to do earlier, I added Trinity Stamps Stunning Silver Baubles. Now, the reason I like these silver baubles is that there's teeny tiny ones, and that's what I'm using here, all the way up to really giant sized ones. And I like that there are so many sizes included. There's also a gold set, and then Trinity Stamps has tons of different embellishments, all kinds of sequins and gems and unique things, which you've seen me use in a lot of videos lately. So I did want to mention that it includes these teeny tiny ones that are perfect for these little snowman buttons. So let's look at the completed card. Sorry, it's a little shiny there. I had to open up the window. It was just beautiful outside. And there, when you remove it from an envelope, it pops up nice. So you can see that because the front and the back panels are thick, because I layered cardstock, it doesn't get like droopy in the middle, and it pops up beautifully. There's a closer look at the shadow effect where you see the blue in the back with little white snowflakes stamped. The final size of this card when flattened is 4 inches by 9 inches, and it fits wonderfully into a letter size envelope. So if you have letter size envelopes at home, you can definitely use that. If you're looking for some higher quality ones in pretty colors, I will link to the ones that I found recently that I really like and I showed today down in my YouTube description. So there you can see how it fits beautifully in an envelope. Okay, let's move on to our second example. This one pops up a little bit differently. This is more of a box shadow card, but it is really easy to do and a great way to use your border dies. Looking at the completed card first, when it's flat, it's about 4 inches by 9 inches, but it pops up to have the shadow box effect on the bottom. Now for the bottom, I used a border die. This is the Trinity Stamps Rooftop border die. So I die cut it from white cardstock 2 or 3 times, and I'm sandwiching in between the layers little pieces of Lawn Fawn pearlescent vellum. This is a fun vellum that has like an iridescent look to it. It's really cool, and I thought it'd be neat in the windows. This particular die is 8.5 inches long, so it's great for slimline card. If you don't have a border die that long, you can use a smaller border die and cut it once, move the die over and line it up and cut it again to make a longer border. So you can get creative with the products you have. I just thought this was fantastic as is, and you could cut it smaller for traditional card size. So now I'm gluing another die cut on top of it so the vellum is sandwiched between. And again, it's good to make sure that the elements on the front and the back of our card are sturdy so you don't end up with a floppy looking shadow box. I'm also using the Trinity Stamp Slimline Stitched Strips die set. If you make a lot of slimline cards, this is something to consider. It cuts thin strips, but also strips with faux stitching. These are 8.5 inches long. If you don't have dies like this, you can definitely just cut your own strips. I die cut 2 with the wide stitched border die. I'm using these strips to kind of bump up my rooftop border so it stands up a little higher. So I'm onto one of those strips. I'm gluing the bottom of our rooftop there. And then I just cut 2 thin cardstock scraps to go under there. Remember, my rooftop is 2 layers thick. I wanted to kind of build up between my stitched strips. So I put 2 scraps in there, and now I can glue the other strip on top of that. I know folks like to avoid building up layers so they don't have a bulky card to go through the mail. However, with a shadow box card, layers are important so that it's strong, especially when it's a long, narrow card like a Slimline. So just add the extra postage if it's too thick for regular postage. The Slimline cards don't require extra postage unless they weigh more or are too thick. So just keep that in mind and you can take it to your post office to test. Next, I have a piece of navy cardstock that is 4 inches by 8.5 inches. And I'm taking the Christmas Magic star image here to stamp across it. Now notice it's too long for my Misty stamping tool. You can get a bigger stamping tool, but who wants to do that? So I am just putting my paper in there crooked. And you can see now the stamp fits fine. So sometimes with these longer slimline stamps, you need to get creative in your stamping tool. Another option is to lay your stamp down on your work surface. Then ink it up and lay your paper on top of it and then gently rub over it. That way you can transfer the ink and you don't need a large stamping tool or a large acrylic block. So both options work. I just like to usually get creative with whatever stamping tool I have. So I stamped that with white pigment ink, so I'm heat setting it so it doesn't smear. Now I have the Santa image from the same Christmas Magic stamp set, lining that above the stars. This one happens to be short enough for my Misty stamping tool. I use my anti-static powder tool, stamp this with VersaMark ink, and then I'll add gold embossing powder in heat set. This will give a beautiful gold Santa image in the sky. By the way, there are coordinating dies available if you wanted to pop up the Santa image. Now that we have the back of our card and the front of our card done, we just need to create the little pop-up feature on the sides. For this, I have 2 pieces of navy cardstock. These are 3 inches by 1 inches each. I'm putting them both into my scoreboard at the same time to save time. And I'm scoring at 1 inch and 1.5 inches. So 1 inch and 1.5. This will create like the two legs that will be on the side of the card that will allow it to pop up when you take it out of the envelope. This is a different way to create a pop-up or shadow box card than the last example I showed you. Now we need to attach these to our background. On the smaller part, or the bottom of the foot like I like to call it, I'm putting strong adhesive and lining up the first fold line with the edge of our background. So you'll see here I'm gluing that down, and we still have that fold and flap sticking off. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Use a strong adhesive here. Strong liquid adhesive or double-sided tape is preferred. So I'll line up the first score line there, and you'll see I have these two legs or arms kind of sticking off the background. While that dries, let's glue a piece of white cardstock to the back of our card. This is 3¼ inches by 8¼ inches. And I'm putting adhesive on it and gluing it to the back. This adds stability to the back, but it also gives us a place to write our message. This is where I write my messages on my shadow box cards. I just put them on the back of the card. If you wanted to, you could glue another card on the back of the card, and that way there's something to open, but I just write it on the back. Now I'm putting adhesive on the front flap, the longer flap that's sticking off, and I'm lining up the score line with the edge of our front border. So you see how it's hanging off there? Then we'll do the same thing on the other side. So I put adhesive on this flap. I'm kind of generous because I really want this to hold. Line up the score line with the edge of our border, and there we have our front border attached to the back. You can see how it pops up nicely. So I could have made this deeper by doing my two score lines farther apart, but I think 1/2 inch is good. So here's a look at the completed card. When you take it out of the envelope, it pops up. The flat final size is 4 by 9 inches, but then when it pops up, it's 4 inches by 8.5. There's a place to write your message on the back, and I also added Trinity stamps Oh My Stars in silver to the background, so you can see those holographic stars that I glued to the back. So this really didn't take that long at all to put together, and it's a great way to use your border stamps or border dies to create a fun shadow box effect. Okay, let's move on to another example. This has a giant rainbow on it. This is another one of those die sets that I've been really wanting to use. Here we have the Trinity Stamp Slimline Rainbow Builder dies. It has this giant fun rainbow, a cloud border, and then 2 smaller cloud pieces. You could definitely use large oval dies to create a large rainbow if you wanted. So I die cut the large rainbow from different colors of scrap cardstock, and on white cardstock I'm gluing them together to form the rainbow. Once I have all the arches glued together, I will just cut around the rainbow's edge so I have an individual rainbow piece that I can add to pop up in my shadow box card. I also created a long border using the cloud border die. I die cut 3 of these borders and glued them together for some strength and dimension. And I'm gluing that right to the bottom of my rainbow. The width of this is 8.5 inches. You can see my background piece there. I'm not actually gluing onto it, just using it for planning purposes. I also have these little corner cloud pieces from that same die set, and I'm gluing those behind the rainbow. So this is just giving some layered looking dimension to our card. And it also is helping to define the edges of our card. So this is again 8.5 inches wide, this piece that we're creating here. Now I have the 2 leg pieces to attach our border to the back of the card. These are 1.5 by 4 inches. And I'm scoring both at 1 inch and 1.5 inches. So you can see those legs. The size of your legs really depends on how wide your border is. This border is a little bit taller than our last one, so I made them 1.5 inches tall. You can make them bigger and then trim off anything hanging out if you wanted. So I'm gluing the large front flap onto the back of our border here. So you can see how the first score line is lined up there on the edge, and the rest of it is hanging off the back. And then I will do the same on the other side too. Once again, I'm using a strong adhesive. Now, while this dries, I figured I'd go ahead and add my sentiment along the front of this. For my sentiment, I'm using the Sending Monster Hugs die. Now you can see the word sending is script, the word monster are individual letters, there's a strip die, and then the hugs. I decided to skip the word monster, and I just have sending hugs. I die cut it twice from white cardstock and then once from a holographic cardstock and glued those together for stacked dimension. Now I'm gluing all of the hugs letters and the sending word right onto our border cloud. Now I have my background piece that is 8.5 by 4 inches, and I also added a piece of white cardstock to the back of that where I can write my personal message. On this, I'm adding 2 more of the cloud corners, but in the top corners. So we have lots of layers going on here. Now we can put adhesive onto those last 2 flaps, the bottom of these feet here, and line it up with the corners of our background. Now at this point, I was concerned that the center would flop down on this. I wanted to make sure the center popped up okay. And I thought I'd show you a little trick. If you're concerned about this too, you can make a little pop-up feature. This is a scrap of cardstock that's 2.5 by 3/4 of an inch. You can do it smaller if you want. I scored it at 1/2 inch intervals. So I have this piece that I can put adhesive on one flap and fold it over to create a cube. This little cube I can glue behind the front panel of our card to the back panel, and it'll give some stability and help with the pop-up feature. So let me show you. I put adhesive on one side of the cube, flip it over and put adhesive on the other side. So you can see it's on this side and on that side. And then I slide this in towards the middle behind my cloud and I adhere it in there. So this will help to pop it up when the person takes this out of the envelope. Now I don't normally add this, but if you're doing a card with not many layers where it's a little floppy, this can help to make sure it pops up nicely. So this is only a card I did this for, but you really don't need to do it if you have lots of layers and your front and back are really stable and strong. So when you take this out of the envelope, it is originally 4 by 9, but it pops up to 4 by 8.5. You can see all the holographic shine that you get to this thanks to the holographic cardstock that I used on the sentiment. And then I used Oh My Stars silver sequins from Trinity stamps that have a holographic look to it too. So this is another way to use your dies creatively to create a slimline shadow box card. All right, let's move on to another example. This one uses a slimline frame die cut on the front with a pop-up feature there in the middle that looks like it's floating or framed there. This is a great way to use your specialty slimline frame dies. So this is the Trinity Stamp Slimline Envelope Builder die set. This is a great die set because it has the dies you need to create your own slimline envelope of any paper you want. I'll link to a video that shows how to do that. However, today I'm only using that rectangle frame with the scallop edge, and later I'll use the Hello Friend die cuts. So I'm just cutting out here that rectangle frame with the scallop edge on the inside. That will be the frame of our card. I'm also using the Trinity Stamps Rainbow Hug add-on die set. This is actually to make wraps for mini coffee cups. So you can do a rainbow wrapped around the card or the hands wrapped around the card. But I thought I would use them to create a rainbow and the hands to hug a heart on the front of our card. So I'll be using the arms and the rainbow of this. But you could cut your own rainbow strips if you wanted. So I used that rainbow die to cut from a bunch of cardstock scraps. Now I have a piece of white cardstock that I'm covering with adhesive, and then I will lay the rainbow scraps onto it to form the rainbow. Now I wanted my rainbow to be extra long to go across our slimline card. So I cut 2 of each color, and I'm gluing those together to form a bigger rainbow arch. There in the middle where they meet, I will hide that with the heart and arms that we'll add on later. So here I'll just form a really long rainbow. After I've glued down each of the colors, I'll just cut along the outside edge there so we have an individual rainbow piece. Now I die cut from white cardstock the frame scallop die I showed you earlier. I put glue on the front of it and I'm laying my rainbow into it. I then die cut another of the same frame and put it on top. That way the rainbow is sandwiched between. I can cut off the excess. And our frame has stability. Again, one layer of cardstock really doesn't work on these. You really want to double it up so there's stability and it's not floppy when you take it out of the card. I also die cut a large heart and then also hands that I can glue to make it look like we're hugging the heart. I'll add a stamped sentiment strip also. Now while that dries, we can complete the back of our card. This will also include the pop-up feature. I have a piece of gray cardstock that is 10 by 3.5 inches. I'm scoring 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch from each end. The reason these measurements are smaller is our flaps need to be smaller since we're using that narrow frame die, which you'll see in a moment. So I'll fold along those score lines and we end up with a piece that seems very similar to everything else we've done in this video. Now we can glue this frame to the front of it. So I'm putting double-sided tape onto that little 1/4 inch flap on each side. This little flap will get glued to the back of the frame die cut that we have on the front of our card. By the way, this will end up being, I believe, 8.5 inches by 3.5 inches. That's the dimension of that frame that we have on the front. So you can see how this will form yet another type of shadow box card. I did glue an extra piece of white cardstock to the back so that it has some stability and also a place to write our personal message. So let's look at the completed card. You can see there's lots of wiggle room in that envelope. And when you take it out, it pops up to be the shadow box. I did add some holographic stars to the background there. Those are from Trinity stamps. They're Oh My Stars, and they come in silver and in gold, and they're just gorgeous. I thought it'd be a fun little thing to add behind our heart and our rainbow. Now the Hugs for You sentiment is from this Trinity Stamps with Sympathy stamp set. I actually took the hugs from the healing message and the For You and teamed them together to create a new sentiment. Okay, my next card also uses a die that's meant for slimline cards. Again, if you don't have slimline dies, you can always do a traditional card size using the same techniques and just change the dimensions. Remember, I do link to a video showing that. Now in this card, it looks like elements are floating and it stands up vertically. So it's a different type of shadow box. So I have a piece of cardstock that is 9 by 6, and I'm scoring at 1/2 inch and 1 inch from each end. I have to rotate my cardstock around since my scoreboard is shorter than my cardstock strip. But all you need to do is get those score lines on each side, 1/2 inch and 1 inch from the edge. I actually have 2 pieces that are cut to this size, 9 by 6, and I'll do the scoring the same on both. So this will have a pop-up or shadow box feature similar to our first card. Remember the one with the snowmen? But this time it'll stand up vertically instead of horizontally. Just like on the first card, I'll fold along our score lines and I'll create this little Z sticking off the background on both sides. I find this is one of the best ways to create a shadow box card where you have these little springs on the side that help it pop up. I will do this with both of the pieces. So there you can see we have the front and the back of our card. Next, I'm using the Trinity Stamp Slimline Hip to Be Square die. Now this die is 3.5 by 8.5. I die cut it from white cardstock, and this will get glued to the front of our card. However, I need to make sure that you can see through those windows. See, right now you can't see through the gray cardstock. So here's the trick that I did, and this was a real time saver for me. I just traced inside of the corner windows. And this will allow me to know where to cut on my gray cardstock so that the openings are the same on the white. Now, I'm not crazy. I am not going to cut each of those little window openings. I'm just going to cut one large window. I like to start from the center and cut these sloppy X's to the corner. That helps to get your scissors in there and cut along that outside pencil line. So basically, I'm cutting a rectangle window in the front of this panel. It doesn't need to look wonderfully nice or be a perfect rectangle because I'm going to cover it up with this die cut. So it really doesn't matter. If you had a rectangle die that size, you could definitely use that. Now on this, I'm putting adhesive, and then I'm putting a piece of acetate. This will be a clear piece across the whole thing. So this is cut to a little smaller than 3.5 by 8.5. Now you can use any acetate for this, but I used a laminating pouch. If you watched my last video, I had lots of leftover laminating pouch pieces, leftover scraps that people wondered what I did with it. Well, here's what I do with it. There's nothing in it. It's just a laminating pouch left over from the technique that I did, a big piece of acetate, and I glued it between each of these die cuts. So I have a window kind of sandwiched between these 2 die cut pieces. Fantastic for this technique. But again, any acetate piece would work. Now behind the die cut edge, I'm putting some adhesive and then I'll glue it onto the front to hide that sloppy rectangle window that I cut. So now you can see through the front of this wonderfully. Another reason I like to use laminating pouches for windows like this is it's super thick and strong, so it'll give us stability on the front of our card. Now we can glue these two halves together. This time I used liquid adhesive on the flap on the back to adhere to the flap on the front. So there you can see those little flaps there sticking out will be adhered together. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Again, you could use double-sided tape here if you prefer to. Now back to that acetate piece or that laminating pouch that I used. It's actually serving two purposes here. One is it gives some stability to the front of our card, but the other is it's going to allow me to have floating hearts in those little window panes. It's just a fun effect to have. Now to save time, I completed this card off screen. It's very easy to do. I die cut a bunch of little hearts from scrap cardstock and glued them to the front of those clear windows so it looks like they're floating. I also die cut Hello from the Trinity Stamp Slimline envelope builder die set that I showed you earlier, and I glued that on the front of the windows. Now check it out how that stands up vertically and it pops up when you take it out of the envelope. You can see how the hearts are floating on that acetate window that we put in there. That's also serving to make the front of our card very strong, so it's not floppy and stands nicely. You can see how this flattens nicely to 4 inches by 9 inches to fit in an envelope, but when you take it out, it pops up, thanks to that spring-like feature we added to the sides. On a cardstock strip, I stamped Hang On to Every Promise of God, and that's from this Trinity Stamps Hang On stamp set. And I put that right below the Hello. I love that stamp set and the sentiment's wonderful for this card. This is definitely a great card to put on display, so I encourage you to try a vertical slimline shadowbox card. Okay, I have one last card for you. This one I wanted to squeeze in, and then I have one additional idea to share with you. This one again uses a frame die cut to form the card, but I used acetate on the window too. This is the Trinity Stamp Slimline Foliage frame die. It also comes with those little flowers and leaves, the additional dies. I die cut this once from dark green cardstock, and I'm putting tape around the outside edge. Now onto this, I have another piece of laminating pouch. So this is a laminating pouch that has been run through the laminator. It's nice and thick and shiny. This was actually leftover again from the technique video that I showed last, and I'll link to that here if you missed it. So onto this adhesive, I will lay that piece of laminating pouch. Again, acetate or recycled plastic would work great here. But this gives stability to this very delicate looking frame. I really want to make sure that the front is strong when I'm making these shadowbox cards, and that acetate does the trick. I die cut another of the foliage frame from a lighter green cardstock, put adhesive on the back of that, and then this will go on top of the acetate. So the acetate is sandwiched between the two green die cuts. I will rotate it so that the foliage is offset so it looks more layered. You could line it up if you wanted to, but see how it's rotated and it just creates a fuller looking border. Now remember the Hugs for You card I created earlier with the rainbow and then the heart with the hug around it? I used the exact same technique to assemble this as I did that card. So I cut and scored the background piece in the same way. And then I put adhesive on the outside flaps. And then I glued our front border piece to those flaps. So if you want to get the dimensions for this, it's the exact same as the Hugs for You card I did earlier. So this will end up being, when standing up, 8.5 by 3.5, but when it's flat, it'll be 9 by 3.5. So there you can see me glue that border or that little edge right onto the front border too. I did put white cardstock on the back of that so I have a place to write my message and to add some strength. So let's look at the completed card here. I did add additional flowers from the foliage frame die set and then little pearls to the center of those. The Hello Friend is from this envelope Slimline builder from Trinity Stamps that I showed you earlier. You can see how this stands up easily and how beautiful that acetate is there. It also gives us a place to glue that Hello Friend so it looks like it's floating there in the middle. So if you're doing a shadow box card in a slimline size and you find the front to be a little too weak, try adding acetate to it to give it some strength like I did here. Now before we go, I just wanted to show you a card I started, but I ran out of time to finish because this video is already an episode as is. This is the Snowman Builder from Trinity Stamps. This is the cutest die set. You can make tall snowmen for a slimline card, like the top two examples, or a small snowman, like on the bottom there, for traditional card size. I like that this die set could create either. I created this little guy. Is he not the cutest? Perfect for a slimline shadow box card, and I was going to make it look like he was juggling these snowballs. So I hope to finish that off screen, and maybe I'll share it over on Instagram. I just thought that was so cute and wanted to show it to you. Lila and I had fun assembling this guy and plan to make more of them. I just had to show it to you. I thought he was so cute. Okay, so there you have lots of ways to create slimline shadow box cards. I hope you'll try this. You can even use your regular dies and stretch them and see if you can come up with a slimline design using them. If you're interested in the products I talked about, they are linked below in my YouTube description. In the middle here are a couple other videos, including the shadow box card videos in a traditional size. You can also click there for my blog where I have lots more information. Thanks for visiting. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you soon.